Today, two views on the topic of mandatory animal identification.
Our underlying policy has been for quite some time that we are supportive of a nationally significant traceability system for animal disease only.
That's Ethan Lane with NCBA, and then we'll also hear a different perspective on the same topic from Justin Tupper of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association.
Definitely against the government or anybody forcing us to mandatorily ID any of these animals.
Two independent conversations as I ask a variety of questions on this controversial topic, like, is a foreign disease a legitimate concern? Is our current system of tracking working? And can this be market-driven versus government-mandated, and more? That's all on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm your host, Justin Mills. We thank you for joining us here on our program. And if you are a regular listener to the program, you know that last week we did not have a new show out, and there was good reason for that, as you're probably very well aware, as you see on social media or you're reading on different things. Wyoming and Montana and some other states have really been in the news as of late with severe wildfires. Well, our particular area where I live in northeastern Wyoming, we also had not the severe fires that you're reading about, that's several 100,000 acres, but we did have, in the matter of about a 24-hour period after one storm had went through our area here, we had about 15 calls that we went out on over the course of about a 24 to 36-hour period. And I will tell you, our resources here in our county were pretty well stretched then. I'm on the volunteer county fire department myself, so we were out on 3 different fires during that time, and it was just kind of hard to get a program out last week. But nevertheless, we're hoping to see some containment on some of these fires that you're hearing about in north central Wyoming is where some of them, and of course one of them that just took off about a week ago that just and went up into Montana as well. And so keep all these ranchers in mind. We thank all the firefighters and all the resources that have been put towards all of the wildfires here in the West. And there are a lot of places, if you're in an area and you have the ability to offer some hay, or you offer even financial help, or even pasture to some of these ranchers that have been severely hurt by these wildfires, please look up the resources that are out there. There's a lot of them available, and we sure appreciate the help. And again, a big thank you on behalf of the ranchers here in the West for all of those that are helping with their resources and considerations and prayers for everybody involved with that. Well, as we turn towards our subject here today, it is the topic, as you heard there in the opening, on mandatory animal identification. And we will hear from two organizations that have some differing views on this particular topic. As we know, it was in 2003 when the USDA announced that the National Animal Identification System was put into place to help respond to animal disease outbreaks. And it would require the livestock and poultry owners register their premises, identify their animals electronically, and report their animal movement. Now, really didn't see much movement in that until 2013, when the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, otherwise known as APHIS, began requiring identification and travel documents for livestock that cross state lines. What's caused the stir, of course, lately has been, starting November 5th of this year, adult cattle and bison shipped interstate are required to have an EID ear tag. Now, there's some elements to that we'll uncover here today with our guests, but nevertheless, that is where we're at here as of today. Now, it is a topic, as I said, that has been quite divisive in the industry, so I thought we would go out and get two industry organizations to provide us with an interview so that we could talk about, their platform, and then some of the questions I have regarding mandatory animal identification. So our guest here today, first up will be Ethan Lane, who is Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and then later on in the show, we will hear from Justin Tupper, who is President of the United States Cattlemen's Association. So first up will be my conversation with Ethan Lane, Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, as we discuss the topic of mandatory animal identification. Ethan, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Pat, Justin, good to be with you.
Let's just start the conversation, first of all, with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's position statement on animal identification.
Yeah, national or NCBA's position on this issue has been the product of years and years of work by our volunteer leaders. We've had a traceability working group going back several years now. That group has included producers and execs from state affiliates from coast to coast. So, as we do anything at NCBA, as diverse as we are, it's important to get those voices from all different pockets of the country, different parts of the supply chain, and kind of make sure we're really kind of getting all those different perspectives in there. And, it's been a conversation that's gone through the paces of looking at, how much data does anyone really need to have there? How much is too much? Our underlying policy has been for quite some time that we are supportive of a nationally significant traceability system for animal disease only. And that doesn't say mandatory. It doesn't say voluntary. It says a nationally significant system. That is a belief of our members, our producers around the country, that if there were to be a disease outbreak, let's say an FMD outbreak comes, FMD comes in on the bottom of somebody's boot coming across the border to the south or something like that, the 72-hour ground stop that would mandatorily occur from USDA, were that to happen, the economic consequences for our producers not being able to move cattle, not just for that 72 hours, but until such time as we could start demonstrating what parts of the herd were free and able to move, is a threat real enough that we need to be very serious about figuring out how we as an industry protect ourselves and build a system that makes sense. But that being said, the conversation for years has been dominated by, I think, the same concern. Every coffee shop conversation in the country has been about this, right? How do we make sure the government doesn't have too much information? How do we make sure they're not abusing that information? What's their appropriate role at the federal level? We know we trust our state animal health folks a lot more in most cases than we do federal officials. And that's really been the tenor of that conversation at NCBA for a very long time. In the last 2 years, that has moved into kind of a new realm, I think, where, of the 44 state affiliate organizations we have, you have some that have policy on their state books that says we support mandatory full chain traceability, full stop, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have other states that are not nearly in that spot. And we have a lot that are in the middle, kind of trying to figure out what they think about that. And that's before you get into brand states versus non-brand states and, all these different nuances from coast to coast. But that's really been kind of the state of the conversation for the last couple of years. And really at our convention in Orlando last year is where there was a pretty robust discussion about, hey, where are we at on this as an industry? And I think what came out of that was a policy that says we recognize that USDA has been engaged in this and is going to continue to be engaged in this. They are moving a rule that is going to impact some of our producers. It is going to require that their current metal ear tag switch to an 840 tag, or anything that is electronically and visually readable and approved for use. So how do we feel about that? And how do we want to engage with that? And what we came out of that meeting with was, in addition to that policy that says that we support a nationally significant ID program, that says in this case, in this rule, we're supportive of the fact that they're switching to that electronically and visually readable tag. So, what that doesn't say is, gosh, we're in support of the government taking over traceability. It doesn't say we're in support of tagging all cattle in a mandatory way. It just says for this class of cattle that's been required to be traced since 2013, we are supportive of them changing the technology in the ear tag from a metal ear tag to an 840 tag. Mm-hmm. And that's really, in the last couple of years, the only real update that we've had to our policy. But that's where we stand today from a national perspective on EID.
Mm-hmm. Ethan, one of the things that comes up, and this has been NCBA's position statement a lot of times, and you just mentioned it, was the fact of concern for foreign disease outbreak. And my question would be, are we overplaying a little bit the legitimate concern for a disease outbreak, such as foot and mouth disease?
No, I mean, full stop. No, I don't think we are. I think when you work in the policy side of this industry every day, and you kind of look at the brink we come to sometimes on different issues, right? And I think back to the Holcomb fire. I think back to the beginning of COVID when we lost 40% of processing capacity overnight. The high path issue a few months back, right, where we didn't quite know yet what that was going to look like. We know now how much more limited the spread of that is, and right. But you get these kind of peeks behind the curtain where you recognize what a real deficit could be for our average producer on the ground if something like this were to happen. And then we look at the rest of the world. We look at, FMD in Indonesia right now, and the Australians, the Japanese, bailing vaccine at Indonesia, trying to keep it at bay, trying to make sure it doesn't come onto their shores. We look at different parts of the world where the presence of a disease in the past 10 years like that means that they have no real ability to export. Those consequences are real ones for our producers around the country as far as their ability to be profitable in this business. So, no, I think because of all of those factors, we don't have the luxury in 2024 of not worrying about a foreign animal disease outbreak on American soil.
Mm-hmm. We're going to jump in here and take a break. My conversation will continue after the break with Ethan Lane, who is with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We're talking about their position on mandatory animal identification. And when we come back, the first question we're going to jump into, isn't the current system that we already have in place good enough? That and other questions when we continue back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we head to break, this segment today brought to you by Zoetis. Back your instincts and feel more confident in your replacement selection this fall with Inherent Select from Zoetis. Visit beefgenetics.com/Working Ranch to get started.
Build a better herd with genomic EPDs for your commercial females. A cattleman is only as good as his tools. So add Inherent Select from Zoetis to your shoot side lineup to back your intuition and to help reveal the replacements with the potential to be the most productive and profitable in your herd. Keep the best. Sell the rest. Zoetis makes it easy. Order free supplies today so you can easily collect tissue samples when you work cattle this fall. Visit beefgenetics.com/Working Ranch to get started.
When it comes to agricultural real estate, there's more options than always just looking at selling. Well, that might be what you end up doing. However, have you had somebody sit across the table from you and provide you with different options that are available? Both the folks at Hall & Hall, they can assist you with that. They've been doing it for several years. Not only do they provide broker real estate all throughout the United States and Canada, they also provide long-term financing for buyers, but yet they still have that desire to see land stay in production agriculture. Whether it's with the current family ranch or with new owners, they can help with day-to-day operations to hiring to lease negotiations. You go to their website at hallandhall.com. You can find out more information about all of the services they provide. Hall & Hall, dedicated to land and landowners since 1946. Well, today's show definitely is a little bit different than we'd normally do, but it is on a topic that has been very divisive within the industry, as we are hearing from two different organizations regarding their view on mandatory animal identification. We already have been hearing from Ethan Lane, who is Vice President of the Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We will continue our conversation with him in just a few moments, but following that, and in the following two segments, we will hear from Justin Tupper, who is President of the United States Cattlemen's Association. When we left off, we were talking with Ethan Lane regarding EID, and specifically the question we were getting into next was, is the current system that we have in place now good enough? Let's jump into that conversation now. The one argument from the other side of this is that the current system that we have for tracking livestock, of course, in our part of the country, we have brand laws, so a lot of us have to do brands. That's not always the case in every state across the union. But at the same time, we have those, and the states that don't have some other methods, I'm sure they're tracking. They say the current system works. And especially when you talk about a 72-hour time frame, that's kind of the number that's been thrown out for getting some control or getting movement figured out or things like that. With the current system, can't that be handled in 72 hours?
So, just based on what we've seen with high path, based on, and remember with the high path thing, we were talking strictly about dairy cattle. Those cattle are already traced. They already have traceability in that system. And, you look at the speed of commerce, you look at how fast you would need to react. If we were to have an FMD outbreak, if we were to have a 72-hour ground stop, and we talked about this at a meeting I was at here in South Dakota yesterday. It's not like at the end of 72 hours, the veil lifts and everybody just resumes movement, right? If we were to have a situation like this, we're going to spend that first 72 hours just dealing with trucks that are on the road, right? That you're going to have yards that aren't going to let them unload. You're going to have trucks on the road loaded with cattle, with nowhere to go. And that is before we start talking about how do you get cattle out of yards that were there when the outbreak started. And the only way you do that is as quickly as possible, being able to demonstrate that here on my operation, I've not come in contact with anything that's popped hot for FMD or whatever it is we're talking about, right, that day. And the quicker you can do that, the better. When you look back at 2003, the speed with which we did that meant months, right, before even sort of triage and really starting to get into getting back to a normal flowing market. And that doesn't even get into the consequences with our overseas trading partners, right? We sent about $11 billion, $10.5 billion worth of product overseas a year. Most of that is stuff that American consumers don't want to eat. So, it's not as simple as, gosh, we'll just sell it here unless we want to really get people interested in eating tongue sometime in the near future. We got to find those foreign markets. Those will shut down tomorrow if we have a problem like that. So the speed with which we can do that and the ability to quickly access that data and demonstrate that FMD, clearance or whatever the diseases we're talking about really does matter. And so, yeah, in brand states, I'm from Arizona. I mean, in states where that works, we know that works at a local level. We know that it does the job we need it to do in some instances. But when we start looking at that larger playing field that we're operating on now, and the speed with which we can do that and the efficiency with which we can do that accurately really does matter. And that is an area where technology makes a difference. I was talking to a guy yesterday who told me, on his operation, he can AI like 100 animals an hour. And he's, moving at a pretty good clip. And he said, I'm doing that though with a wand, and I'm logging that data quickly with that wand. He said, if I was having to write those numbers down, I'd be at 50 an hour. And that's not, that's sort of a niche example, but it's at the end of the day, beyond the fact that we need to be able to trace disease, the idea, I think, for a lot of people here is this makes the process more efficient if it's done properly and allows you to kind of take one more variable off the plate. I think that's the hope of a lot of people who are interested in this is it's an upgrade in the efficiency with which, the average producer can get through their day.
Mm-hmm. Ethan, earlier in our conversation, you talked about, as you were explaining the NCBA's platform policies on EID and animal traceability, you said you guys were in favor of a nationally significant system. That sounds awfully like you want a mandatory program to me.
No, but it's not. And I hear you, but it's not. What it means is if you have an outbreak, what happens in California is going to at some point impact what's going on in Wyoming, right? And we've seen that with IPAC. You have the federal response, and then you have individual states with different, state vets and different departments of agriculture that are having different reactions to the same issue, right? Even amongst themselves, there are sometimes some disagreements on exactly what a test result might mean or how you react to that test result. So, eliminating one of those variables in that conversation and saying, look, we know one piece of this, no matter where this specific class of animals is moving in the country, there is going to be the ability to access that information that's needed. And we're not talking about, I know there's a lot of fear about, gosh, they're going to be able to access the methane emissions and cattle numbers and all these different things. There's a really, I think, an important need here to understand how limited the scope is of what's being discussed here at the federal level in this rulemaking. You're talking about prim ID, time, and location, right, of an animal. And that's it. This is not, nor does it have the ability to be a more expansive sort of monitoring platform for the government to gather this information. So, it's important to have an understanding of the scope of what we're talking about here. It's not nearly as broad or, I think, scary as some folks have gotten worried that it could be. It's pretty darn limited. This is, hey, if there's a disease outbreak, states have that data. USDA, if they need to, in a disease outbreak, can quickly access for a larger matrix. This is where we have, an issue, or this is where this animal came from. And the idea there is it's an insurance policy for all those producers that didn't interact with that. And we got that lesson at the beginning of HIPAP. The amount of ground that some of those dairy cattle covered coming out of the panhandle of Texas, that's a big map, and it covered a lot of states very, very quickly. And I think that's the reason it's got to be big enough to be comprehensive in that multi-state environment.
Mm-hmm. Ethan, one of the things that we've done on our operation is we've started moving away from metal clips. I don't even know if they do them as much anymore. When we bangs vaccinate our heifers, and they started going with EID tags that would, of course, fall under the qualification or meet the criteria for what's needed. So my question would be is, why not let this be somewhat market driven? In this, for example, okay, if my neighbor over here chooses not to participate or do anything or do these kinds of things, but yet I do, I'm at least protecting myself. I've got this animal, tracking thing if I so choose, and I might probably be using it for some marketing purposes, or I might be using it for just my own production element. I'm getting some benefits because I see both efficiency and then maybe from a marketing standpoint, why not let that drive this?
So I'll give you the same example from high path, where you have a state that's free of high path, right? Movement is different than in a state where you've got, a couple dairies who have received some animals that are exhibiting symptoms. All of a sudden, those movement restrictions, regardless of the precautions you've taken on your operation, your neighbor didn't take those precautions, and now you are restricted in your movements potentially with your cattle. I mean, it does have an impact on what your neighbor does when you start talking about a disease event. So, I agree with you. I think in a larger sense, driving through the marketplace is the best way to have this really take hold. But I think that's happening already for a variety of other reasons, right? Guys are in branded programs, they're doing other things, and they're using those tags because it pencils for them on their operation. And I think that's happening at the same time, and that we're talking about this. What we're talking about here, what USDA is contemplating, what our policy talks about internally at NCBA is really about that basic layer of protection, right? If you were to have an incident, and it's not calves that are going to slaughter. It's not animals under 18 months. It's intact breeding stock over 18 months. So it is the same class of cattle that has required those tags with interstates since 2013. There's no change in that class of cattle. I mean, all we're talking about here is a hardware upgrade in, the year tag, which, it's also important to remember. If you read that rule, it says it's electronically and visually readable. So, we've heard a lot from the sale barns on this issue, and I get that. But if they don't want to use it, they don't have to. They can eyeball those tags, just like they're doing now. And there's nothing that says that they have to move to a reader or a different system here. The way this has been drafted, if they don't want to opt in, in doing that, they don't have to. Well, all it says is when the tag goes in, it's got to be one that can be both electronically and visually readable.
Ethan, Congresswoman Harriet Hageman out of Wyoming, along with 14 co-sponsors, have introduced a bill that would halt the implementation and moving forward with the USDA's plan. What's NCBA's thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been opposed to that. I mean, she's taken a what I guess I'd call a broadsword approach to that issue. It's instead of kind of talking through, okay, how do we address this in a way that eases people's concerns? Her approach has just been burn the whole thing down. And, that isn't something that has been terribly popular on the Hill. She ran a similar amendment in the appropriations process this time last year, September of last year. Out of 435 members of Congress, it got less than 100 votes. That's kind of where the issue is at this point. And I talked to Congressman Hageman a few weeks ago about this issue. We've obviously been in discussions with members of Congress across the spectrum. And, look, like any other issue in the cattle industry, the members are reflecting what they're hearing from their producers in their state. And those opinions run the gamut. If you talk to the Kansas delegation, they look at this issue differently. If you talk to the Florida delegation, they're hearing, positive things from their producers down there. So you've got those same differences in opinions across the country that we have in the industry.
Final question here, and that is some collaboration within the industry, within groups within the industries that see this issue maybe a little bit differently. Some of them are definitely maybe way extreme differently versus some that maybe aren't quite as extreme. How do we bring everybody back to the table and try to come up with a solution on this?
I think we continue to sit at that table, right? And I think our producer leaders across the country are always there and open to talking. I think it's frustrating for a lot of our leadership around the country when the position that they take is villainized to a point where, basically the accusation is you're trying to destroy the industry, right? Rather than you have a different perspective on how to attack this issue than I do. And so let's talk through those things. I mean, our policy process is a big and broad and messy 44 state affiliates, all of them with county cattlemen's associations, right, that have wildly different opinions. And so, I mean, no matter where you go in the country, you have those discussions happening both at the local level, the county level, the state level, and all of that feeds into that national conversation. So, I mean, we're having those tough conversations amongst our affiliates on a regular basis. So, I mean, it's hard for us to feel like, gosh, we're, as an association, we're not doing that hard work, because we are. It's just, if people aren't engaging with that process and instead saying, well, that process doesn't count because I don't like the group, or I'm opposed to them on some other issue, I don't know how to fix that other than to keep offering the platform, right? And I think that's NCBA's responsibility as an affiliate-based national organization. Our responsibility isn't to drive an opinion. Our responsibility is to facilitate a process for producers from wildly different backgrounds around the country to come together and figure out a common position on an issue. And that's the best thing we can do to translate, I think, something at the national level that speaks for the largest group of producers we can put together.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ethan, I appreciate you taking the time. As we said earlier, you're on the road. You're in Sioux Falls, South Dakota here today, and I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. And just some final comments from you real quick.
Yeah, I spent the day yesterday at Dakota Fest. I mean, it's always great to be out of Washington and out on the road because talking to our members and producers is a lot more fun than talking to Congress. So, this time of year, my team's out around the country and they're always a lot more excited to do that. So we're just kind of trying to drag our feet, spend as much time in fair season out around the country as we can before these guys come back to Washington and start throwing punches again at each other. But I appreciate you having me on.
You bet. All right. Thanks, Ethan.
Thanks.
And again, that was Ethan Lane, Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We're going to take a break here, and when we come back, and for the next two segments, we're going to hear from a different side of that same issue, as we'll hear from Justin Tupper, President of the United States Cattlemen's Association, and their view on mandatory animal identification. As we head to break, this segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. Find out more at their website by going to gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I hope you at the break had the opportunity to go refill your coffee cup, and I hope it's what I've been drinking, Cowpuncher coffee, and I've got a fresh steaming cup here right next to me. It's what we drink here on the X-Ring Ranch and here at the studios at the Working Ranch Radio Show. You can choose from a lot of different varieties and flavors at Cowpuncher Coffee. Give Jim or Tricia Williams a call or check them out online. You can go to their website at cowpunchercoffee.com. Grab a mug and let's spur the day with Cowpuncher Coffee. Well, as we jump back into our program, we're just kind of about halfway through. As if you missed the first two segments, we are talking mandatory animal identification. And in those first two segments, we heard from Ethan Lane and the view of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Now we have with us Justin Tupper, who is president of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, and he's also the owner of St. Onge Livestock in St. Onge, South Dakota. Let's jump into that conversation with him on this issue of mandatory animal ID and the view of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. Justin, I know you're on the road. Thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Hey, appreciate it. Thanks for having us.
Well, the topic of animal identification definitely is one in our industry that has a lot of controversy back and forth. And so as we explore this, I think let's first start with basically, where is the U.S. Cattlemen's Association at on mandatory EID?
Yeah, absolutely. Our organization is opposed to mandatory electronic identification or mandatory identification in general. We believe that if it's a tool you want to use to enhance price or make it work for you and your ranch, well, then you should be able to do that. But we're definitely against the government or anybody forcing us to mandatorily ID any of these animals.
Justin, I know one of the biggest things that comes up when we start talking about USDA's animal ID, and of course they even have this in their name, animal disease traceability, is that element of quick response should an animal disease come to the United States. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind in these days is foot and mouth disease. But from an animal disease traceability standpoint, that's really the purpose that they're looking at on this. Do you feel like what we have in place now can be an adequate response should something happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think when you talk about disease traceability, that is something that should be vital to all of us within the industry. We need to be able to trace any of those things that we may or may not know what they are, even what kind of diseases they are. But we have systems in place today that do a very adequate job in tracing these livestock. You know, all our interstate movements are tracked and ID'd, and And we go through a very extensive process already. So we believe that we already have all the tools we need to do that. We don't need to mandate a certain kind of electronics or any of those things mandated to make sure we can trace them. But it should be vital in our minds. We need to be able to make sure we can track down some of these diseases and find the cause and where they come from in a very reasonable fashion. But the industry is pretty good. It's the safest, best protein on the planet for a reason, and we think we're already doing those things.
I know in states such as where, you and I are out here in the western half, of course, you're out of South Dakota, half the state's a brand state, half the east side of the state is not. But when we start looking at that, a lot of guys in the western half of the United States or brand states would say, well, we can track. We've got those kind of methods of tracking these animals that way. What about these states, though, that don't have brand laws? Is the ability to track in those states adequate enough?
Yeah, and I think it is more difficult in states that don't have that. But again, we have laws that if they move across state lines, they have to be ID'd. That has to be put on a health paper, and it's got to go with the cattle. And so there are definitely ways already that we're identifying these livestock. Do we think that there could be a better method? Well, there may be, but it has got to be more universal. We can't have 8 different ways that we're identifying these livestock and then try to think we can sell them or move them at the speed of commerce that we need to. And I think that's one of the things that's really wrong with what the USDA has been pushing, is that they want to encompass all these things, but that does not make the speed of commerce work better. An electronic ID, could we read those through the ring? Is there technology out there that could make that a much faster, safer, better process? Yes. But if we have low frequency tags, high frequency tags, and we have visual tags, then the process gets more cumbersome and we've done nothing but go backwards.
So as you talked about it, and you kind of addressed this a little bit in the position statement about what you would like to see, but expand a little further. What does, in your guys' opinion, what would a good system look like that you feel is right for the producers in the country?
So any system that we're going to move to has got to be more efficient. And there is technologies out there, we know this, that would make the system work much better. Can we ID all of the livestock that they're talking about and know that that's going to happen? I don't think so. I don't think there's any way that they can get everyone into the system. So if we can't identify them all, then really what is the end goal? So I think the systems in place work. I think we can get to where we need to be in a disease traceability standpoint. Another issue that we haven't talked about is who would hold the data in this case. And that becomes really, really important and can be quite the tool that could be used against us. And that's something that we're very cautious of too.
And I know that was something that you guys brought up, was the real concern. There were a couple concerns. First of all, cost to the industry, cost to the producers specifically, but the control of data in all of that. And so you're not necessarily wanting a mandatory, so you're wanting a voluntary, but even in a voluntary standpoint, where would that data, how do you envision that data being held and managed?
Well, I think that is the whole question. Just exactly what you said is the question. Who would hold the data and who has the ability to do it without being able to be used in a manner that was used against us? So, we have USDA tells us all the time we can't get all the data because of its proprietary information to the packers. Well, what about proprietary information to the individuals raising the livestock? And I think that's one of the big things, confidentiality. They tell us that all the time when we're at USDA. Well, this would be confidential information also. And I don't think there's any one entity out there. I think a lot of our states, our animal industry boards, or whichever way they're titled in each state, are awful good. And they do very good things, and maybe they could handle it, but that doesn't go for all 50 states. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's a lot of confidence in some of the other states that could be done. So those are questions that, they all would need to be answered before we ever get down the road to this mandatory ID that I think is the vision that they want. They want to be able to ID all the animals, and they really haven't been very secret about that. It used to be, that was the elephant in the room. And today, I think they tell you that that's what they want. And that's why I think we have to stand up and push back pretty hard.
So there would be some that say with the EID tags that we're looking at of putting in these animals, some are already doing it. For example, I've moved away from the metal clips with bangs tagging my heifers and been putting EID tags for the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, isn't there some management tools from a producer standpoint that they could be looking at, and let alone where the government side of things, but the use of EID tags from an operational standpoint?
And we think there is, and I believe that there is, and we do some in our own. We put in EID tags in our own calves, but it's to enhance the value of them at sale time. The problem with the mandatory ID that the government has told us time and time again, they want to be tech neutral. Mm-hmm. Well, the speed of commerce will not work at tech neutral. We can't have those low frequency tags that you're putting in Wyoming as a Banks tag, plus a visual ID tag, a metal clip that we have to look at, plus a high frequency tag that I might put in, plus another tag that somebody else has. And so now you have to have 7, 8 readers, and some of them you can read through the ring, some of them you have to run down an alley. The process and the problem for getting all that done to manage these cattle and move them in a speed of commerce that we do today is impossible with the way they're trying to go about it.
We're going to cut into our conversation here with Justin Tupper, President of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, as we're getting their views regarding the topic of mandatory animal identification. We're going to pick it up, and when we come back, I want a little bit more clarification whether or not our system is capable of tracking at the speed of commerce that he was talking to, plus several other questions that we'll get into with Justin after the break. This segment today brought to you by Barn Owl. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl, build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Are you tired of putting the wear and tear on your ranch pickup, or your good side-by-side out checking stock tanks or reservoirs? Or maybe it's just keeping an eye on a remote ranch location. When you stop and you think about it and you start to calculate the cost of your time, fuel, and miles on your vehicles, you're going to scare yourself. But there really is a very simple and a reassuring solution, and it's called Barn Owl. Barn Owl off-grid cameras and smart alerts provide you that assurance, and there's no question it is a time and a money saver. From anywhere at any time, no Wi-Fi or power needed. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Our topic today is on mandatory animal identification. And just in case you missed the first 2 segments, we heard the view of NCBA in those first 2 segments. Now we're in the middle of our conversation with Justin Tupper, who is president of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, as we hear their perspective on it as well. Let's jump back into that conversation now with Justin. So you talk about the speed of commerce and bring that up, and I'm going to revert back again to maybe the previous question or topic that we talked about a little bit ago, and that is the reaction time should something come into our country. Are we capable? Do we have the ability to track at the speed of commerce that you're referring to with this? And I'm probably asking kind of the same question again here, but do we have the ability to react at the speed of commerce if should something happen?
And I believe we do. You know, we back tag all the way up cows. Anything that moves across the interstate line is now ID'd and on a health paper. We've had these outbreaks of different things that they've had to track with TB and whatnot, and we've been able to do that very successfully in a pretty good fashion. And we would use several of the tools. It might be brands, you'd find them. It might be a back tag you'd trace back to from a way up cow. It might be off a health paper, but there are lots of ways that we move cattle today, and the ID systems that are in place that we already can track those. So I believe pretty confidently, if there was an outbreak, we'd be able to trace it down as quickly, and they can't tell me, or I've not had anybody be able to tell me that just because we went to a mandatory ID, they could do it faster, and I don't believe we could.
Justin, this last summer, we kind of dealt with a little bit of a animal disease outbreak with avian flu, bird flu in that. I felt like we didn't see the reaction that maybe I was expecting to see. Are we overplaying foreign disease as a concern?
You know, I think there's no question it should be a concern, and we have to be cognizant of the things that could come in and literally destroy our industry. So I think we have to. So it's tough to say that we overplay it or downplay it. I think it has to be in the back of our minds. It has to be something that we can manage. If something happens, we've got to be able to isolate it and get there quickly. We have a lot of good tools in place to already be able to do that. So, you know, the avian flu was kind of a different deal. It was funny how the cattle markets reacted, and it was in dairy cattle, and we didn't see any change in milk prices. So I think a lot of those are used as scare tactics sometimes, and why the cattle market reacts the way it does, or seems like it reacts to any of those things more quickly than a lot of the other commodities. I don't have an answer for, but I do think we have to be cognizant of disease traceability. It's got to be something we need to be able to do, but I don't think anybody could come out and say that a mandatory system would be better than what we have in place today. I just don't think that's true.
I want to talk now about Congresswoman Harriet Hagerman introducing, along with 14 co-sponsors, and I think Senator Cynthia Loomis out of Wyoming also doing something on the Senate side regarding kind of putting a halt to where the USDA is at on this. I know you guys came out, U.S. Cattlemen's Association came out in support of that. Any comments regarding that in the whole context of this conversation?
Well, I think it's a huge overreach by USDA to come out and say that, that we're going to mandate this to be electronic tags and then try to be tech neutral. And the whole system of the way that they've tried to roll it out has been pretty flawed. And there are things that we could work on in the systems we have in place right now to improve them. And I guess with our support of Hageman's bill, that's one of the things we're saying is that we know there has to be some traceability. We know that we've got to be able to find these outbreaks, but putting a mandate of a tech neutral tag out there that does nothing but slow down commerce. I mean, really no change in doing the tag that they're proposing versus a visual tag. We still have to run the animal down the chute. We've still got to process that all the way through. So there's no advantage. We don't understand the process that they're doing to get there and why it would be better, because it's not.
One of the co-sponsors on that was Representative Thomas Massey out of Kentucky, and a quote that he said was that the government will know where every animal is and who owns it. I feel, and I've felt for some time, they already do. And why do we continue to use that as a scare tactic to not move on some of these issues?
Well, and I think you're right. I think it's a sensitive issue when you talk to producers. But the truth is, if you've ever been to the FSA office, if you've ever taken any government subsidy of any sort, they already know exactly what you have. And that's very true. But what can they do with this data? If they had this in a even more encompassed database, what could somebody possibly do with that? I think that is a tactic that we should be looking at. We need to make sure that our proprietary information, our confidentiality is protected. I mean, who's to say once you could trace this, if this calf ends up in Canada and somehow has a strange disease, that they don't come back and that sits on the producer that originally produce that animal, and who knows where that disease came from in between or anything that had done. So there's huge liability complications with it. And I think we've got to be very, very vigilant in that stance. Should we use the old tactics that, the government's going to know we're doing? I'm in your court there. I just don't think that's the case. I think if they want to know, they already know. We pay taxes. There's lots of ways they already know those things. Yeah.
From your guys' perspective, wanting this as a voluntary basis, would you say to producers that if you want to help yourself, you're good to make this voluntary and keep it voluntary, but if you want to help yourself, maybe you would consider putting these tags in your cattle?
I think any time that something like this comes about, if there is a monetary way that would help the industry, if you can enhance the price of your livestock by having this ID, if that's what somebody wants, I think there's a conversation to be had, and this really stirs everybody up with cool. I mean, if we want cool and we want to be able to identify ours, then there has to be some form and some way to identify those cattle that they were born, raised, and produced here in the United States. So somewhere there's a merger there that could have monetary and results for the producer that are something that's good. And that's why we believe in the voluntary part of the system. And as well as I do, if your neighbor's getting $10 100 more than you because you put these tags in, and now we get mandatory cool, or we get a cool system that pays the producer for what they're raising, then everybody's going to do it, and they're going to buy in, and we'll have most of the people with those ID tags in. So I think anytime it can be led by something that happens in the marketplace, then that makes it much more palatable at the producer level.
Justin, let's talk about the Cattle ID Working Group, because that was something that was established several years ago. And you guys had mentioned about, let's get back to that. Let's try to come from an industry standpoint in this of trying to really come up with a solution.
And I think that's very true. I mean, no matter whether we like some of the things they're doing or whatever, if you don't have a seat at the table, then they're just going to do things and force us to do things that we can't do within the industry. Or, and I put my sale barn hat on here. I mean, we already have to do, if we have a weigh-up cow sale and we're right on the border of Wyoming and Montana, if we have 2,000 weigh-up cows in sale, probably 1,500 or 1,800 of them go back to the chute today. Mm-hmm. It's a very cumbersome process. I think there are ways that we could work to mitigate some of that. And so we would love to sit down again and say, okay, if Hageman's bill passes, we're going to not have these mandates, but let's figure out a way to make sure that our industry's safe and make sure it can happen in a speed of commerce and work for our producers.
Mm-hmm. So Justin, the 5th of November is when this rule by the USDA regarding EID tags and cattle and bison. Now for us as ranchers, it's going to be specifically for sexually intact cattle and bison that are 18 months of age or older. We're not quite sure what's going to happen with the legislation that we talked about earlier back in Washington, D.C. But by the 5th of November, are we going to have tags, EID tags in these cattle?
Well, and that's kind of a misnomer with what the new USDA rule said. Basically, the new rule that stirred everybody up just says that now they're going to accept electronic ID as a form of identification that they like an E40 tag or they'll accept that. That's really the only change that went in place, is that we can have those as acceptable forms, not just the metal clip or an 840 tag that was official identification before. So not too much changes there, but I think it stirred the conversation into exactly why we're talking today.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Just some final comments from you regarding our conversation here today.
Again, I think it's very, very decisive in the countryside. I think almost no producers I talk to want mandatory ID. I don't think anybody wants the government mandating things to us. Again, I think that we have to be reasonable and make sure that we can have an assessment of disease traceability. It does need to be part of the conversation, but I think we can enhance the tools that we already use and make that better. I don't think a mandatory ID system would fix any of those things. So for those reasons, that's where we are and where we stand as U.S. cattlemen. And we're going to continue to fight for the independent producers and try to make sure that we're putting more money back in your pocket, not taking them out. That's one other little piece of anything that comes up. If they want to put these protocols in place, we got to make sure the federal government's going to pay for them. That isn't going to come out of the producer's pocket too.
Well, again, Justin, thank you. Appreciate you taking the time here to join us on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thank you.
And again, that was Justin Tupper, president of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, providing us with their view here today on the topic of animal identification. Just a couple things here before we go to break. And first thing would be just the format that we did here today. I realize there were probably answers given by each of the guests here today where it would have been nice to maybe hear a rebuttal from the other side of that on that topic. However, these were individual interviews that I did and conversations that I had with them independently, and so that's just kind of the way it went down. So I thought I'd just tell you that from the start here. Second thing is both of them. Justin mentioned it there at the end of his conversation, and Ethan also at the very end mentioned that having a seat at the table was important for us as an industry to come together on this particular issue and topic, and to address the concerns that producers have out there. I think that's noble in itself, and I think that's really what it's going to take. I think the other side of that too is making sure for both of these organizations, or any organizations that want to be a part of the solution of this topic, would be making sure that they're not more concerned about sitting at their table, but rather than sitting at a table as an industry to come up with a solution on this topic. This segment today brought to you by Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring for all from the convenience of your phone, powered by solar, satellite, and cell. Keep an eye on your water supply with a daily text message. It's what we use here to keep an eye on our water cistern tanks. Call Meadowlark Solutions today for tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more. 801-252-6135, or check them out online at tanktoad.com. And joining us now with a look at our long-term weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, as we're kind of find ourselves here on this Labor Day weekend and moving out of that, what it looks to me from a long-term standpoint, after we've seen some cooler conditions in our part of the country, a lot of moisture setting in the south part of the United States. And you say also in conjunction with that, might see a tropical storm emerging at some point.
Yeah, over the last week, we've seen a couple of cold fronts and storm systems push out of northwest Canada and the Pacific Northwest, even bringing some snow to the northern Rockies and the Canadian Rockies over the last week or so. Now, what these fronts are doing is they're pushing a lot of dry air across the central and western United States, so there really won't be much moisture, but the dry air boundary is pushing all the way down into the southern areas of the U.S., and then it's running into Gulf of Mexico moisture that's going to be pushing up from far southern New Mexico and Texas, then east along the Gulf Coast and into the southeastern United States. And basically that boundary between the drier air and that Gulf of Mexico moisture is going to produce a lot of shower and thunderstorm activity. There could be some good rain in Texas, maybe getting as far north as Oklahoma, even parts of southern and eastern New Mexico, but it's not going to get much further north than that. And we're also looking at the possibility of something brewing out in the Atlantic. We probably will have a named tropical storm or hurricane in the coming days that could affect the southeastern United States. It could go to the Gulf of Mexico. It could right along the eastern seaboard of the southeast. By late next week, something we'll need to keep an eye on.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update. Unfortunately, we're a little short here today as I went long on my interviews with our guests, but we look forward to talking to you next week.
See you then.
You bet. And you can catch meteorologist Don Day on his YouTube channel each and every morning by going to his website at dayweather.com. The Captain's up next after the break.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Folks, don't forget to take the family into town for an ice cream cone or something like that. Just break it up a little bit. I know we're all busy here and everything, but you got to take time for the family. Justin, this presser just in. North American cattle industry leaders meet to discuss common challenges facing producers across Canada, United States, and Mexico. This happened August 21st in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. The Canadian Cattle Association hosted the third 2024 triannual trilateral meeting with its North American counterparts, the NCBA and the Confederación Nacional de Organizaciones Ganaderas, CNOG, that's the Mexican counterpart of us, on the sidelines of the Canadian Beef Industry Conference. The trilateral meeting gives an opportunity for leadership to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing beef producers across Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Topics at this year's trilateral focused on trade policy, the upcoming review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement in 2026, and international engagement on antimicrobial resistance. All right, so folks, we are going to sick one of our writers on that one and get it into the next issue of the magazine. Or maybe, Justin, you might even want to do a little bit of a follow-up on what happened, what they talked about, that sort of thing. Either way, folks, we're going to get you the information as soon as we can. Back to you in the booth.
All right, thanks, Captain. And switching subjects here on you just a little bit here, but the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine is out. In fact, you should be looking for it coming to your mailbox. And if you don't have a subscription, you can get it started by going to workingranchmag.com. Be sure to tune in next week at the same time, same place, or on your favorite podcast provider. Remember, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine. Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.